Why do some of the most brilliant minds constantly question themselves? Why is it that people with high intelligence, deep expertise, and a track record of real accomplishments are often plagued by insecurity, while others, with far less knowledge, exude an unshakable sense of confidence? This isn't just a personality quirk. It's not humility, it's not anxiety. It's a deeply rooted cognitive paradox, one that science has uncovered and psychology has explained. And it might just be the reason why so many capable individuals silently suffer, paralyzed by self-doubt, while mediocrity climbs the ranks of leadership with reckless certainty. This paradox was identified by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger in a landmark 1999 study. What they discovered was unsettling. People who are incompetent at a task often lack the very skills needed to recognize their incompetence. As a result, they drastically overestimate their abilities. Meanwhile, those who are genuinely skilled are not only better at the task, they're also more aware of the complexities, the nuances, the limits of their own knowledge. Ironically, the more competent someone becomes, the more conscious they are of what they don't know. And that awareness breeds doubt. This phenomenon became known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it reveals a painful truth about the human mind. Metacognition, the ability to evaluate your own knowledge, is both a blessing and a curse. It allows you to think critically, to improve, to evolve. But it also opens the door to chronic self-questioning, to imposter syndrome, to a relentless internal voice that whispers, "You're not ready." Now imagine the implications of this. In a world increasingly driven by perception over substance, where visibility often trumps capability, those who lack expertise frequently step forward with confidence, while those who are actually qualified hesitate. A highly intelligent person may spend years acquiring knowledge, sharpening skills, and perfecting their craft, only to feel paralyzed when opportunity knocks. Why? Because they've seen the depth of the field, because they understand that what they don't know could still be vast, and because they've been conditioned to equate certainty with legitimacy. But here's the twist. That doubt is not a flaw. It is not evidence of inadequacy. In fact, it might be one of the clearest signs of genuine intelligence. The internal conflict experienced by smart people isn't a malfunction. It's metacognitive awareness doing its job. And yet, that same awareness often becomes a psychological trap. Highly capable individuals begin to hesitate, hold themselves back, and underestimate their own readiness. Not because they lack ability, but because they refuse to lie to themselves about the complexity of reality. This video is not just an explanation of the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a deep dive into the psychological mechanics behind why intelligence so often leads to hesitation. It's an invitation to question the stories we tell ourselves about confidence, competence, and credibility. And most importantly, it's a roadmap for how to break free from this trap, without abandoning the intellectual humility that makes deep thinking possible. By the end, you may come to see your self-doubt not as an enemy, but as a signal, one that, when properly understood, can be transformed into a new kind of confidence, a calibrated confidence, one rooted not in ignorance, but in truth. To understand why intelligent people are often consumed by doubt, we need to begin with the curve, a deceptively simple graph that illustrates one of the most profound cognitive distortions in human psychology. The Dunning-Kruger curve maps the relationship between actual competence and perceived confidence. At first glance, it looks like a hill followed by a valley, gradually rising into a modest incline. But what it represents is the inner terrain of self-awareness, why people so often misjudge their own abilities, and why brilliance so often masquerades as uncertainty. Let's walk through the stages of this curve. The first stage is the peak of Mount Stupid, a fitting term coined to describe the initial surge of confidence that emerges when someone knows just enough to believe they're an expert, but not nearly enough to realize what they've missed. At this point, the person's competence is extremely low, yet their confidence is irrationally high. They've read one article and suddenly they think they understand the entire subject. They watched a documentary and now they believe they could debate experts. What they lack is not just information, but the awareness of their own ignorance. This is where many of the loudest voices in any field tend to reside. Then comes the crash, the valley of despair. This is the brutal awakening that occurs when someone begins to learn just enough to understand how much they don't know. Confidence plummets, while competence slowly begins to rise. Here lies the territory where most smart, self-aware individuals live. They've moved beyond superficial knowledge and into complexity. They've encountered contradictions, exceptions, and edge cases. They've realized that the topic isn't as clear-cut as they once believed. And now, their inner voice grows louder, not quieter. Am I really qualified to speak on this? What if I'm missing something? What if I'm wrong? This is not weakness. This is growth. As a person continues to learn, they eventually reach the third stage, the slope of enlightenment. Competence increases steadily, and so does confidence. But now, it's tempered. It's grounded. It's no longer the blind, brash overconfidence of a novice. Instead, it's the cautious, considered belief of someone who has seen both the depth and breadth of the field and understands the weight of what they know and what they don't. Finally, we arrive at the fourth stage, the plateau of sustainability. This is the mindset of the true expert. Someone who has refined their understanding to the point where they can speak with authority in specific domains, while humbly acknowledging their limitations in others. A genuine expert no longer needs to perform confidence. They possess it quietly, precisely, and with boundaries. They might say things like, "I can speak confidently about this particular topic, but not that one." This isn't doubt. It's discernment. It's calibrated self-knowledge. And yet many intelligent people never reach this point. Why? Because they get stuck in the valley. They never make it to the slope of enlightenment, not because they lack skill, but because the psychological burden of awareness is too heavy. When you're intelligent, you're not just learning facts, you're absorbing uncertainty. You're not just mastering a topic, you're recognizing its infinite branches. You're not just seeing the data, you're seeing the limitations of every framework used to interpret it. And if you're not careful, that awareness turns into paralysis. Meanwhile, those who remain confidently perched on Mount Stupid seem to glide through life untouched by complexity. They speak boldly in meetings, volunteer for tasks they're unqualified for, and accept opportunities they're not prepared to handle, because they don't know they're unprepared. And ironically, their misplaced confidence often convinces others. This is the cruel paradox. Those who should hesitate do. Those who should hesitate don't. But this paradox is not unbreakable. It can be understood, navigated, and even overcome. And to do that, we need to go deeper, not just into the curve itself, but into the psychological mechanisms that cause intelligence to generate doubt in the first place. In the next section, we'll explore exactly why smart people see so many cracks in their own expertise, and how those cracks, if misunderstood, can become cages. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Now that we understand the structure of the Dunning-Kruger curve, we need to confront a deeper question. Why does intelligence create self-doubt in the first place? What is it about being smart, informed, or competent that leads so many people to question their own abilities, sometimes to the point of self-sabotage? To answer this, we have to examine the mechanisms beneath the surface. Intelligence is not just about processing information. It's about reflecting on the process itself. And this ability to think about thinking, what psychologists call metacognition, is both the engine of self-awareness and the source of doubt. The first mechanism is metacognitive sensitivity, the ability to evaluate the accuracy of your own knowledge. This is a critical trait of intelligent individuals. They can step outside of their own thoughts and examine them critically. They question assumptions, challenge conclusions, and constantly audit their own beliefs. But here lies the paradox. The more metacognitively aware a person becomes, the more they begin to see gaps in their understanding. They notice contradictions, inconsistencies, and uncertainties that others overlook entirely. Consider someone studying nutrition. The beginner reads a few articles and decides sugar is evil and fat is good. Simple. But the more the person studies, the more they realize that nutrition science is riddled with conflicting studies, individual variability, and shifting guidelines. The result? Confusion, doubt, but also a more accurate, realistic understanding. This person is now aware of the limits of their knowledge, not because they're failing, but because they've grown. This awareness can become debilitating, especially in a world that rewards quick answers and inflated certainty. People with less metacognitive sensitivity don't see the holes in their knowledge, so they operate with blind conviction. But those who do see the holes begin to question whether they're capable at all. The truth is, they're often far more capable than they think. But the cost of their insight is psychological friction. The second mechanism is what researchers call the curse of knowledge. Once you know something deeply, you forget what it's like not to know it. You assume everyone else sees what you see, thinks like you think, understands what you understand. And so you undervalue your expertise. You dismiss your knowledge as basic or obvious because it feels that way to you, not realizing that others may be miles behind. The result? You feel average, replaceable, unimpressive, not because you are, but because your frame of reference has been distorted by depth. Third, intelligent individuals often fall into toxic comparisons, but not with the average person. They compare themselves to the top 0.1% in their field. A young physicist doesn't compare themselves to the average university student. They compare themselves to Einstein. A competent writer doesn't look around at their peers. They look up at Dostoevsky, Woolf, or Baldwin and think, I'm nowhere near that. This high standard, while admirable, often becomes a source of chronic dissatisfaction. The smarter you are, the more you understand what excellence looks like, and the more painfully aware you become of your distance from it. Fourth, we encounter the familiarity bias. You live with your own thoughts. You hear your doubts, your failures, your messy internal dialogue. But when you look at others, you only see the final product, the polished presentation, the public confidence, the curated success. You compare your internal chaos to their external image, and it feels like you're losing. But what you're forgetting is this: they have chaos too. You just don't see it. Together, these mechanisms form a kind of psychological trap. Intelligence becomes a double-edged sword. It opens your mind, but also exposes you to complexity, contradiction, and uncertainty. It expands your awareness, but also makes you painfully conscious of your limitations. It gives you the power to analyze, but also the burden of never being satisfied with easy answers. And here's the most important truth: these traits are not signs of weakness. They're signs of consciousness. Your doubt doesn't mean you're broken. It means your mind is awake. It means you're paying attention to reality instead of clinging to illusions. But now we must ask, what do you do with that awareness? How can intelligent people learn to navigate their own doubt without falling into paralysis? Is it possible to develop confidence without abandoning honesty? To take action without becoming blind to complexity? In the next section, we'll begin to shift gears, moving from diagnosis to solution. We'll explore how intelligent individuals can develop a calibrated sense of confidence, grounded in evidence, not ego. Confidence that doesn't require arrogance, just clarity. By now, it's clear that intelligent people doubt themselves not because they're weak, but because they see reality with a level of clarity that makes certainty impossible. But in the real world, in job interviews, in leadership, in entrepreneurship, in social dynamics, confidence is currency. It opens doors, wins trust, and inspires follow-through. And yet, there's a problem. The world often mistakes ignorance for strength and self-awareness for weakness. This brings us to one of the most damaging illusions in modern society, the myth of confidence as competence. We are conditioned, almost from birth, to equate boldness with ability. The student who speaks up the most in class is assumed to be the most knowledgeable. The employee who volunteers for every project is seen as a go-getter, even if their results are mediocre. The leader who speaks with assertiveness, rarely pausing to reflect, is celebrated as decisive. Meanwhile, the person who questions themselves, who thinks before speaking, who hesitates before committing, is often labeled as uncertain or insecure. But this perception is based on an illusion. The Dunning-Kruger effect revealed this illusion with brutal clarity. People with the least ability in a given area are often the most confident. Why? Because they lack the cognitive tools to recognize their own incompetence. They don't know enough to know what they don't know. And so, paradoxically, their ignorance shields them from self-doubt. They march forward boldly, not because they've earned that confidence, but because they can't see the risks, the gaps, the consequences. This type of overconfidence isn't harmless. It infiltrates institutions, misleads teams, and, when amplified by charisma, can propel unqualified individuals into positions of enormous influence. It creates a culture where perceived competence replaces real competence, and where thoughtful minds are overlooked because they don't perform confidence the way society expects. The reality is this: confidence is not evidence of truth. In fact, overconfidence is often a red flag. It suggests a lack of reflection, an unwillingness to consider complexity, and a fragile ego that cannot tolerate uncertainty. True experts, those with genuine hard-won knowledge, rarely speak in absolutes. They use language like "it depends," "there's evidence suggesting," or "within this context," not because they're unsure, but because they know better than to ignore nuance. And yet, here lies the trap for the intelligent person. They see this, they recognize the danger of false confidence, and they begin to distrust all confidence, including their own. They equate humility with silence. They hold back from sharing insights unless they're 100% sure. They fear being perceived as arrogant. They become so allergic to ignorance that they forget one important truth. Confidence is not inherently dishonest. It can be calibrated. Confidence doesn't have to be an act. It doesn't have to be a performance. It doesn't have to come from ego. It can come from evidence, from data, from experience, from the track record of your own actions. Confidence can be quiet. It can be slow. It can come with caveats. But it can exist within intelligent minds, if those minds are willing to redefine what confidence actually is. The goal is not to mimic the blind certainty of the uninformed. The goal is to create a new model, one where your confidence reflects reality, not fantasy, one where doubt and self-assurance coexist. So the question becomes, how do you build that kind of confidence? How do you avoid falling into the traps of either arrogance or paralysis? How can you acknowledge your limitations without underestimating your strengths? To answer that, we must move into the practical. In the next section, we'll explore specific strategies that intelligent individuals can use to calibrate their confidence, tools and practices that ground self-perception in reality rather than emotion. Because self-doubt doesn't need to be eliminated. It needs to be understood, reframed, and balanced. So far, we've explored the internal landscape of doubt, how it emerges from metacognition, how it's intensified by intelligence, and how the world often rewards overconfidence instead of capability. But now comes the essential shift, transforming insight into action. If you're a thoughtful, intelligent person who constantly underestimates your own competence, how do you recalibrate your confidence without betraying your self-awareness? How do you move forward with clarity instead of hesitation? The answer is not to mimic the overconfident. It's not to silence your doubt or fake bravado. The answer is confidence calibration, a systematic way to align how capable you feel with how capable you actually are. And this requires both evidence and intention. The first step is building an internal competence log, a personal record of real, measurable achievements. Too often, smart people dismiss their accomplishments because they don't feel impressive. They normalize their own excellence. Of course I did that, they think. Anyone could. No, they couldn't. That's your bias speaking. By documenting objective evidence, certifications, projects completed, promotions earned, problems solved, you create a factual baseline to combat the distortions of self-perception. But don't stop there. Include feedback you've received, emails of appreciation, positive evaluations, comments from people who turn to you for guidance. These aren't ego boosters, they're data points. When doubt arises, you don't argue with it using emotion, you present the facts. The second practice is to distinguish impostor syndrome from real incompetence. Impostor syndrome is not rooted in failure. It's rooted in disconnection from your own success. You've achieved things, but you attribute them to luck, timing, or other people. You fear being found out, even when your performance says otherwise. To test this distortion, ask for specific feedback from people you trust, not vague reassurance, concrete calibration. On a scale from 1 to 10, where would you place my skill in this area? What specific things do I do well? Their answers may surprise you and reveal that your internal narrative is misaligned with reality. Next, reframe your perception of uncertainty. You've been trained to see doubt as a flaw. It's not. Doubt is often the byproduct of expertise. When you say, "I don't know enough," ask yourself, do I know more than 80% of people in this field? If the answer is yes, your doubt isn't proof of ignorance. It's a sign that you're seeing complexity others ignore. And that's a strength, not a weakness. Another critical tool is to adjust your comparison scale. Stop benchmarking your worth against the top 0.1% of humanity. That's not humility. It's psychological sabotage. Instead, compare yourself to the average practitioner in your field. Ask, how do I measure up to most people doing what I do? You'll likely discover that your competence is well above average, and that your doubt has more to do with impossible standards than actual deficiencies. To further calibrate, practice confidence forecasting. Before taking on a task, estimate your probability of success. Then, after completing it, compare the result to your prediction. Over time, patterns will emerge. You'll notice that you consistently underestimate yourself. That means your internal compass is off. By tracking these results, you can fine-tune your confidence to reflect reality, not fear. And perhaps most transformative of all, externalize your expertise. Teach, write, answer questions, mentor others. When you articulate what you know to someone less experienced, something clicks. You realize just how much you've internalized. What feels basic to you is mind-blowing to someone just starting out. And that realization shifts your self-perception from "I don't know enough" to "I've come a long way." But let's not forget the body. Confidence isn't just intellectual, it's embodied. Practice acting as if, not to fake it, but to create the conditions for internal alignment. Speak clearly, stand tall, use direct language. When your actions reflect competence, the mind follows. Confidence is a behavior first, a feeling second. Finally, Embrace the concept of good enough. Intelligent people often fall into the trap of perfectionism, believing that if it's not flawless, it's not worthy. But the pursuit of perfection kills momentum. Instead, define what good enough looks like before you start. Meet that standard, then move on. Excellence is iterative, not absolute. These practices don't erase doubt, they reposition it. Doubt becomes a signal to reflect, not to retreat. And over time, your confidence grows, not through ego, but through evidence. But what happens when these strategies aren't enough? When the doubt becomes paralyzing and begins to bleed into every aspect of life, your relationships, your health, your sense of self-worth. That's when we have to ask a different question. When does self-doubt stop being a cognitive pattern and start being a clinical issue? In the next section, we'll explore the line between normal doubt and destructive self-perception, and when it's time to seek help beyond yourself. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Doubt, in its healthy form, is a signal of awareness. It keeps us humble, grounded, open to learning. But like any psychological mechanism, when taken to an extreme or left unchecked, it can become corrosive. There's a point where self-questioning is no longer a product of intelligence, but a symptom of something deeper. And that line matters. So how do we know when doubt has crossed the threshold from being a sign of high-functioning metacognition to being a clinical issue? The answer lies in observing not just the presence of doubt, but its impact. One of the clearest signs is chronic avoidance of opportunity. If you're turning down promotions, hesitating to apply for roles you're clearly qualified for, or repeatedly backing out of projects due to an overwhelming fear of not being ready, this may signal more than humility. It may reflect a pervasive cognitive distortion, one where your perception of inadequacy has become disconnected from objective reality. No amount of achievement seems to be enough to grant you permission to move forward. This isn't just a confidence issue, it's psychological paralysis. Another red flag is decision paralysis. Occasional overthinking is normal, but when even simple choices become exhausting, when you're stuck in endless loops of what-if scenarios, constantly fearing the consequences of making the wrong move, you're not just analyzing. You're being held hostage by fear, and that fear begins to erode your ability to function, to lead, to act with autonomy. Performance anxiety is another key indicator. This goes beyond feeling nervous before a presentation or interview. We're talking about anxiety so intense it disrupts sleep, digestion, concentration, where your body enters a fight or flight response every time you're asked to demonstrate your expertise. Your mind knows you're capable, but your physiology tells a different story. The brain has become wired to associate performance with danger. Left untreated, this leads to burnout, depression, and withdrawal. Perhaps the most insidious form is persistent feelings of inadequacy, even in the face of clear, repeated success. You graduate with honors, but feel like a fraud. You deliver results at work, but attribute it to luck. You receive praise, but secretly believe others are overestimating you. This is classic impostor syndrome, but in severe cases, it doesn't fade. It becomes a lens through which you see your entire life. And worse, you begin to expect to be found out. Every email from your boss, every question from a peer triggers the fear that this is it, the moment they realize you're not who they think you are. When this level of doubt persists over time, it can evolve into depression. Feelings of worthlessness, helplessness, and despair begin to creep in. You no longer trust your own perception of reality. You assume others are right, and you are wrong. You withdraw. You shrink. You stop pursuing what once mattered to you because the belief that you'll fail has become a foregone conclusion. Doubt has metastasized into self-erasure. This is the point where professional help becomes not just useful, but necessary. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT for instance, is particularly effective in these cases. It helps individuals identify distorted thinking patterns, challenge irrational beliefs, and reframe their self-assessment based on evidence, not emotion. Therapy isn't about eliminating doubt, it's about putting it in context. It helps you re-establish internal credibility. Medication, in cases where anxiety or depression has taken root, can also play a supportive role. It doesn't replace self-awareness, it creates the stability needed to use that awareness effectively. But therapy isn't just for people in crisis. Even high-functioning professionals, CEOs, academics, creatives, seek therapy not because they're broken, but because they recognize the value of external calibration. They understand that intelligence does not equal invulnerability. In fact, the more you understand the human mind, the more aware you become of your own blind spots. Seeking help isn't weakness, it's strategic self-regulation. And sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is admit that your mind, sharp as it is, has led you into a trap it can't escape alone. But there's hope, because once you begin to understand the nature of your doubt and the conditions that amplify it, you can reclaim agency. You can stop letting distorted perceptions govern your behavior. You can reconnect with your competence, not the fantasy of perfection, but the grounded reality of skill, growth, and evidence-based confidence. Which leads us to the final piece of the puzzle. What does a truly calibrated confidence look like? How does a competent, self-aware person move through life, still aware of their limitations, still open to learning, but no longer crippled by doubt? In the final section, we'll pull everything together into a cohesive framework, a protocol for sustainable, calibrated self-trust. A new way to live and work that honors your intelligence without letting it turn against you. So, where does all of this leave you? The person who sees complexity where others see simplicity, who questions themselves while others speak with unearned certainty. The answer isn't to abandon your doubt, it's to harness it. Because here's the truth. The goal is not to become blindly confident. That's the realm of the unaware. The goal is to become consciously confident, to develop a kind of trust in yourself that is earned, grounded, and deeply resilient. Not the loud, performative confidence of those at the peak of Mount Stupid, but the quiet, unwavering confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're capable of, and just as importantly, what they're not. To live with calibrated confidence is to walk a razor's edge between humility and clarity. You recognize your limitations, but you don't let them define you. You see the gaps in your knowledge, but you don't let them paralyze you. You accept that you'll never know everything, but you move forward anyway, because you know enough to begin, to contribute, to lead. This kind of confidence doesn't come from feelings. It comes from evidence. It's built by tracking your wins, noticing your growth, and acknowledging your competence, not just intellectually, but emotionally. It's nurtured through practice, feedback, reflection, and self-correction. You teach, you test, you fail, you learn, and you realize, slowly and quietly, that you are no longer pretending. You are becoming. You stop waiting to feel ready. You act. Not recklessly, but intentionally. Not to prove anything to others, but to stay true to the reality of your own development. You move from chronic hesitation to strategic discernment, from fear-driven inaction to aligned execution. And when doubt creeps in, as it always will, you don't panic. You don't spiral. You pause. You check the data. You recalibrate. Because now, you know what that doubt means, and what it doesn't. This is the path forward. If you're someone who constantly underestimates themselves, someone who feels like a fraud despite all the proof to the contrary, know this. You're not broken. You're not behind. You're not failing. What you're experiencing is the natural tension between deep awareness and honest self-assessment. But you don't have to stay stuck there. Start building your own competence inventory. Start teaching what you know. Start testing your internal narrative against external reality. And most importantly, stop waiting for the fear to disappear before you act. It won't. But it also doesn't have to run your life. You're allowed to move forward, even with doubt in your pocket. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever held yourself back because you didn't feel ready enough? Do you recognize any of these patterns in yourself? Share your story in the comments. Your honesty might help someone else see themselves more clearly. And if this video resonated with you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Because the next video is important, and it builds on everything you've just seen. Keep going. Your clarity is just beginning.